the war.
What is up, everybody? Jeremy Eisenfire here, and welcome to the channel. As we continue to get closer and closer to the release date of 28 years later, we are continuing to get some intriguing new looks at the film, including not one, but two all-new looks at the Alpha Infected, looking even more menacing than the previous one. And we also got some intriguing new information directly from Danny Boyle himself, pertaining to how the virus has mutated over the years, and how we have not one, but two new kind of infected in this film. And we also got some never-before-seen footage in some of the recent behind-the-scenes features and the new TV spots. Starting with an all-new look at Jodie Comer's character, Isla, aboard the train. We have seen in some of the previous trailers that Spike, his mother, and the NATO soldiers end up having a run-in with the Alpha Infected himself on this very same train, but it looks like that's not the only infected they are going to run into during this sequence, as during one of the latest TV spot trailers, we see an all-new scene of Spike's mother boarding the train and coming face-to-face with an infected. And it looks like this is going to be taking place not long before the Alpha himself ends up arriving. And I get the feeling that Spike, or even the NATO soldier himself, will end up taking out this regular infected before their run-in with the Alpha. And judging from what we know about this scene up until this point, I get the feeling after they take out the regular infected, the Alpha is going to arrive and pull Edvin Riding's character out of the train, likely killing him, followed by the Alpha himself boarding the train next, of which we get a glimpse of in the newest trailer, as we not only see a brand new shot of the Alpha actually dropping down and landing into the train, but we also get a close-up look at his face and how deep red his eyes really are. Many were pointing out during our first look at the Alpha a few weeks ago that his eyes didn't look very red, but I always had a feeling that that was most likely just a lighting issue given the angle of the scene. And it looks like that was potentially the case, as we see his eyes are very red here in this scene, as we see a new shot of him proceeding to charge after Spike and his mother. And I'm really looking forward to seeing this scene in its entirety. This Alpha Infected, played by Chi Lewis Perry, seems to be nearly indestructible at times, and I get the feeling he's going to be an incredibly formidable antagonist throughout the film. Which also makes me wonder if there's a slight possibility that he might end up surviving 28 years later and end up showing up in the second film, The Bone Temple. Or do they successfully manage to take him out in this first film? We do know at some point that Spike and his mother are going to end up meeting up with Ralph Fiennes' character, Dr. Kelson. And judging by the way the hero's journey usually plays out, it seems like Dr. Kelson is most likely going to be the mentor figure within Spike's journey. And I wouldn't be all that surprised if Dr. Kelson ends up taking out the Alpha to save Spike, and potentially even dying in the process, especially considering the mentor figures tend not to last the entire trilogy. We have heard reports stating that he's going to be in these first two films, but I definitely get the feeling he won't survive to the third. And with the second film being titled The Bone Temple, I get the feeling he'll have a very special role in that film, but ultimately end up perishing within it as well. But fortunately, that's not the only new shot that we have recently gotten in some of the latest trailers of some of the massive infecteds we're going to be seeing in 28 years later, as we have also recently gotten a new shot of the infected chasing Jamie and Spike down the causeway. And this infected also looks almost as scary as the other Alpha himself, as we see him begin to close in on Jamie and Spike while chasing them down the causeway, just before being taken out by some of the island's defenses, followed by another new shot of what appears to be Jamie looking back at the infected after it's shot. And judging by this and previous shots, it appears the infected comes very close to getting Jamie and Spike, but ultimately ends up dying on the causeway. And these are far from the only new shots that we have recently gotten as well, as we have also just received an all-new behind-the-scenes featurette that not only showcases some never-before-seen footage, but also shows Alex Garland talking a little bit about the subversion of expectations and how Danny Boyle really loves putting that aspect into his films.
What Danny likes is subversion. That's the kind of thing that wakes Danny up. And there's a bunch of things in the narrative that are subversions of genre expectations.
And talks about how there are multiple different things within the narrative that are a subversion of genre expectation, and talks about it as though it is an art form of sorts, in not keeping with the way that the genre would normally function, which is something that we have heard Danny Boyle himself talk about in previous interviews as well, stating that this film does not go where you expect it to go.
There's something almost like a kind of art in not keeping with the way the genre would normally function.
And how, when it's done right, The subversion of expectations can sometimes be the most exciting aspects of a film, especially when pertaining to the horror genre. After all, many horror films tend to follow a very similar format over the years, but Danny Boyle has completely broken that mold with 28 Days Later, and seems to be doing it yet again with 28 Years Later. And I certainly cannot wait to see all the twists and turns that they have in store for us. Alex Garland also goes on to talk about how this is not merely a film about infected, but rather what happens when countries collapse and what people become as a result, which usually tends to be the case in this post-apocalyptic setting. After all, when the rule of law and society itself collapses, we tend to see the very worst of humanity brought to the surface, with people acting on their more baser instincts, which is also something we saw in the original 28 Days Later as well, with the NATO soldiers at the end and some of the despicable acts that they were committing. Within a world setting such as this, we tend to see the darker aspects of what humans are really capable of, and how often it's not the infected that pose the biggest threat to humanity, but humanity itself. Which I get the feeling that we are going to see in 28 Years Later, not only with Jack O'Connell's mysterious character Jimmy, but also with this version of NATO itself. After all, some of the recent rage leaks, which we will be covering much deeper in another video, tend to point to some nefarious acts that NATO is currently committing, in terms of them potentially hiding the truth of what is really happening inside the UK from the rest of the world. After all, it does appear that NATO's main objective is containment and keeping this quarantine intact, which was also similar to their mission in 28 Weeks Later as well, a film that showcases some of the atrocious acts that NATO is capable of when trying to contain this virus, and how no amount of civilian casualties will sway them from their goal. And I get the feeling we are going to see a very similar NATO in 28 Years Later as well, as the film's very synopsis states that they are living under a very ruthlessly enforced quarantine. We also get some never-before-seen shots in this featurette as well, as we see an all-new shot of the sun rising with the tree and the one lone alpha in the background, in the same field that we later see Jamie and his son Spike get chased through. And I really can't say enough about the beautiful cinematography in 28 Years Later. Shooting in a widescreen format such as they did always allows for a much better look at these big landscape shots, and also goes on to create that sense of isolation that he was looking for, especially when adding a character into the foreground. You truly get a sense of just how massive this world is and how small our characters are when compared to nature. It also creates an almost primordial feel as well, seeing humans out in the wild how they used to be thousands of years ago, which seems to be how the rage virus-infected victims have survived over a 28-year period, by getting back to their more animalistic roots and being forced to hunt for their own survival. We also get an all-new look at the massive crawling infected that we have seen in previous trailers, only here it seems that there is a crow landing on him. And we have recently learned that some of the infected after 28 years have devolved into being quadrupedal, meaning running on all fours instead of their own hind legs. But this one in particular always seems to be crawling on its stomach, which could potentially be a byproduct of its size, or could potentially be as a result of the explosion that it seemingly comes in contact with at some point in the film. I also found it very interesting to see that the crow is actually landing on the infected, where usually the infected tend to drive the wildlife away from them, as we've seen in 28 Days Later with the rats, but as we've also seen in some of the trailers for 28 Years Later as well, as it seemed like even some of the birds were fleeing away from the alpha infected on the train. But perhaps, since this one can only crawl, maybe it's perceived as less of a threat. We also get this all-new shot of Jamie in the woods, during what is most likely the beginning of the film, when he and Spike first go on their hunt, followed by an all-new interesting landscape shot of what appears to be a potential sign sticking out of the canopy. And after 28 years of no upkeep, you could totally understand why it might be in a state like this. And after almost 30 years of no human presence, nature would undoubtedly start to take back the land. We also get an interesting new look of what appears to be Spike and his mother being chased through the field by infected. But we also have this brand new up-close shot of Jamie running inside Holy Island, most likely heading for the gate as he charges out into the water during high tide, screaming for his son. We have theorized that at some point in the film, Spike will end up leaving the community on his own in search of a doctor for his dying mother, and most likely ends up leaving a note for his father telling him where he's gone, as Jamie appears to have some kind of piece of paper in his hand when he is charging into the water. And here it looks like we have a shot of him racing through the community to get to that gate. We also get this very interesting new shot of Spike at night with some kind of fire raging behind him, and part of me wonders if this is taking place during his time with Dr. Kelson at the Bone Temple. And judging by the look on Spike's face, it almost seems like he is looking at something that he's not too sure about, as he almost appears to have a slight look of despair in his eye. Could Spike's mother end up succumbing to her illness in the film, and could we potentially see him mourning his mother in this scene? After all, we did just recently see an interesting interview with actress Jodie Comer, who plays Spike's mother, as she suggested to the audience that they bring a tissue with them when they go to watch 28 Years Later, indicating the possibility of some kind of tragedy in the film, with that tragedy potentially being her passing. After all, we do already know that she is in a severe condition at the beginning of the film, and we also have recently learned that her character suffers from memory loss as well. So whatever is ailing her certainly seems to be very serious. And speaking of Spike taking his mother to the mainland, it looks like we get a shot of that scene as well, as it appears to show Spike and his mother walking down the causeway departing the island. And one thing about all of this that still doesn't quite sit right is why Spike felt the need that he had to leave without his father to begin with. You would think that Jamie would also want to find a doctor for his ailing wife, but for some reason Spike feels the need to leave without him. So I'm looking forward to seeing what kind of events transpire that lead to Spike departing alone. Could it potentially be that Jamie just doesn't feel going to Dr. Kelson is worth the risk, considering that he is one of these strange people that live on the mainland? Or could Spike potentially want to do this on his own as a way to prove himself that he has become a man? One thing we know about the hunting trip that Jamie takes Spike on at the very beginning of the film is how it's not just a mere hunting trip, but a way for Jamie to impart some new lessons onto his son so he knows how to survive outside of the community. Could Spike potentially have failed his father's initial test at the beginning of the film, prompting him to do this on his own as a way of proving himself? Or could there potentially be some other reason as to why he departs alone as well? But then the featurette ends with an interesting shot of what appears to be the Alpha or the other long-hair infected staring at Holy Island during high tide, almost as if they're waiting for low tide to come around because they know they'll be able to access the causeway then. We have already heard that the infected are going to be showing new levels of intelligence in this film, as the virus has mutated over the years, which has been confirmed by Danny Boyle himself in a recent interview, where he states that there's not been just one, but two different kind of mutations the rage virus has undergone over the last 28 years, both with positive and negative effects on the infected. He talks about one of the mutations being a sort of inhibitor to the growth of the infected, limiting and stunting their growth severely, which is why we see a few of the infected in the trailers looking incredibly depleted and skinny, and how these particular infected can only rage out for so long before expending all their energy, which could potentially be an explanation for that one infected we see crawling in all the trailers, as it doesn't have enough energy left to even stand. And then Danny Boyle talks about the other kind of mutation, the one that does the exact opposite of deplete energy, but instead acts as a sort of steroid, granting these kind of infected nearly unlimited rage, which is exactly the kind of infected the Alpha is. And I imagine the same with the one that is chasing them down the causeway as well. It seems their mutation has only heightened their strength and their overall ferocity, which now explains a little bit better how the Alpha infected managed to rip off a soldier's head with his bare hands, a feat that would undoubtedly require an enormous amount of physical strength, which now makes Danny Boyle's line about the infected in 28 Years Later being extraordinary creatures. And I find it very interesting how the rage virus has mutated not once, but in two different directions, both of which are seemingly the polar opposite of each other, which makes me wonder why that is. And the first thing that comes to mind is the difference in food source. Could it potentially be that the alpha-level infecteds are the result of infecteds finding a very steady source of sustenance over the last 28 years? Constantly feeding the rage virus inside them so they can continue on and mutate into a stronger form of themselves, compared to the other skinnier kind of infected that don't have a steady source of sustenance and have barely been scraping by, hence why they're so depleted and why the mutation went in the opposite direction? Or could it simply be that this is just how nature has chosen to evolve this virus over the years? Whichever the case, I find it very interesting how the virus has mutated not only once, but twice in two totally opposite forms. And it should be very interesting to see all of the similarities and differences that these two different types of infected end up having. But whatever ends up happening, I think it's a fitting next step for the rage virus to take on a mutation such as this, and I certainly can't wait to see what else it has in store for us. It seems like Danny Boyle and Alex Garland are certainly getting ready to set a whole new standard for what horror films can be going forward, just as they did with 28 Days Later all those years ago. And I can't wait to see all of the fascinating places that this upcoming trilogy takes us. And if all three films end up doing as well as I believe this first one will, who knows where the future of the franchise will take us. But that is going to do it today for our recent breakdown on some of the latest footage surrounding 28 Years Later. And definitely leave your thoughts and comments down below. And will you be seeing 28 Years Later in theaters? And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like on your way out and consider subscribing and joining our Discord to stay up to date on all of our upcoming content. And as always, I want to give a big thank you to everybody out there for watching, and we will see you on the next one.